in this.
That wraps up for me. I was able to weekend social media from our show on YouTube.
I would look on.
So we have 25 participants that I just let in. Thank you for waiting for us in the waiting room there. Welcome for getting through the snow. How about we get started, and I'll keep letting people in the waiting room as they come in.
Fantastic. Thank you, Karen. First of all, thank all of you for joining us today, this wonderful snowy day. We have two wonderful facilitators today. The topic today is the mission to safeguard Black history in the United States. And I tell you what, appropriate at any time, but even more appropriate during Black History Month, obviously. So I'm going to ask our two facilitators if they would introduce themselves. The first I'll ask is Reverend Dr. Richelle Foreman Gunter from St. Paul's Baptist Church.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this conversation. I'm Reverend Dr. Richelle Foreman Gunter, the Director of Social Justice Ministry at St. Paul's Baptist Church and the Political Action Chair with the Westchester branch of the NAACP. I also serve on the board of Chester County Community Foundation, and I'm delighted to talk with you today about safeguarding Black history.
Thank you, Dr. Gunter. Happy to have you with us today. And our other facilitator is Dr. Tracey Ray Robinson from Westchester University. Tracey.
Good afternoon, everyone. Tracey Robinson. I serve as Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Westchester University. I've been in higher education for a little over 25 years. By training, I'm a social psychologist, but I've also taught as an adjunct faculty member in Africana Studies. And pleased to be here to talk about Black History Month. So.
Thank you, Dr. Tracey. Happy to have both of you here again, once again. A couple of housekeeping things I want to go through real quickly, then we'll get to our presentations. First of all, promotional partners. Without these folks, we could not do this, obviously. So just take a note of some of the folks there that are supporting this. And these initiatives are continuing to go strong because of their support. Some of the ground rules, we've talked about these before. I'll give you a chance to peruse some of those. But first of all, being respectful. We're talking about, today we're talking about Black history in the United States, and there will be opinions, and you'll have an opportunity to share some of those opinions, okay? But keep in mind, we always want to be respectful in every comment that we make about anything regarding our community conversations. We're going to ask you that when we go to the videos, if you would please specifically mute yourselves. That helps us with the technological showing of the video, so please, when we go to the videos, please mute yourself. We're going to probably, it looks like we're going to break out into two chat rooms toward the end of this presentation. That give you a chance to have a more up close and personal conversation with our two presenters. So be prepared to ask some great questions and just dig a little deeper into the Black history for the United States. Having said those ground rules, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Richelle. Dr. Richelle, you are on mute.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Yes, thank you, Timmy. I think that this conversation is more important than just talking about Black history. It's really important to remind ourselves that Black history is American history, and American history is world history. And so the reason for understanding it at all is to first recognize that we fit in to a much larger world, a much larger scenario, a much larger view. And so history allows us to get the long view, to really look back and see what we've made permanent not only in our nation, but in our world, and to really begin to think about the past as a guide for the future. And so as we consider knowing your history, I think it's important to remember it's our history. And so we safeguard it, not just for ourselves, not just for our culture, not just for people who look like me. We safeguard it for our nation. We safeguard it for the world. You can see on this slide, it identifies all of the reasons for knowing your history. And last week, when we were thinking about this, we wanted it to be a bit of interaction. So at some point during the conversation, we're just going to ask you to type in just something quick that you know about Black history. We want everybody to participate in that. And we want to remember that what most of us know is just a drop of the knowledge that's out there that really helps us to understand our identities, helps us to understand our culture, and helps us to consider what are the things that we want to repeat going forward, and what are the challenges that we face that we don't want to repeat again. This is a great page. I am so appreciative of all of the work that went into creating this. For those of you who are ever in search of Black history, this page really helps us to see the breadth of again, Black history, which I often refer to as either African history, African American history, and not just Black history. When you think of African and African American history, I want to encourage you not to think of subset West African reflection, not necessarily someone who looks like me, but the full breadth of the continent of Africa is really important when we're talking about Black Americans, when we are talking about African Americans, and when we are talking about African history. Sometimes when we're looking at some of the work of the Bible, and we look at Blacks in the Bible, you know, the great church fathers were North Africans. And so it's really important for us to remember that the breadth of Black history goes well beyond people who were brought here during slavery, but reflects the entire continent of Africa. Next slide. So this, again, a great opportunity to see a timeline of American history, history of Africans coming to the colonies from 1619 through 2008. And one of the things that I think it's important to understand as you look at this timeline, there are places where we see the description of movement, things like the civil rights movement, and attempts to sort of quiet those movements. 1968 as the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. But remember that Dr. King wasn't the only civil rights leader that was assassinated. Before him, Medgar Evers and Malcolm X. And so when we think of the broadness of attempts to quiet the movement, it wasn't just an attempt to stop single individuals. It was Black leaders who were considered having a role in the movement. And so one of the things that I think it's important for us to start to consider when we look at Black history in the United States is, while we have a lot of individual accomplishments, we had a lot of systemic and a lot of institutional setbacks. And so during these attempts to move communities forward, we also have Jim Crow, and we have redlining, and we have gerrymandering. And so it's really important that in the face of individual progress, there was often systemic and institutional practices put in place to undo the efforts that were made by individuals. And so I want to encourage you to look at the timelines that are traced through the lens of, while these accomplishments were great, they didn't necessarily accomplish for Black people in America what the hope was. And I want to encourage you to look at a book called Racism Without Racists. I forgot the Racism Without Racists. I'll get the title and put it in the chat, because it helps us to begin to understand that while we may not point the finger individually, we can look at systems that are in place that are just as effective as an individual racist and the attempts that they make to slow or deny progress. Next slide. Again, this encyclopedia of events only captures the last 24 years. This is but a drop in the bucket of what we consider has been accomplished by individuals since Reconstruction. And so it's really important for us to remember that the accomplishments of Blacks in America is voluminous.
Adams in person when Bishop and Dr.
Is voluminous, and that we want to make sure that we raise the knowledge level of people to its maximum by making sure that we understand that our history goes back not only to slavery, but before slavery. But again, just having information like this just reminds us of the wealth and the accomplishments of Blacks just in this last 20 years. And this particular website is one that I encourage you to use in your own study and in your own knowledge around actually guiding people through recent Black history.
All right, so I'm gonna jump in and take over. I'm gonna be really brief so we can get to our video. You know, but oftentimes when we talk about Black history, unfortunately, it starts with, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue and discovered America. I'm not sure how you can discover a place that people have already inhabited. It's almost like, hey, I discovered Westchester, Pennsylvania when I moved here. And so, and the reality that Columbus was lost. And if you really look at a lot of the writings of the indigenous people, what their experience with Columbus was. And so, it's really important that it goes beyond facts and figures, and that we look at Black history, not just as American history again, but to reiterate as world history. So we can go to the next slide. One of my favorite quotes is, "Until the lion has his own historian, tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter." And so also, as you think about and you study Black history, and this is always interesting, having taught Africana studies for a number of years, looking at it and making sure you're looking at it from an Afrocentric lens. If there's any time to do it, if you're not doing it 365 days of the year, or it's leap year this year, 366 days, then at least do it during Black History Month. Understand the perspective, right, of the lived experience of those whose history is being studied. So reiterating, Black history is world history, it is American history. So next slide. One of the people that's pointed out in the video is Dr. Henrik Clarke. I feel very blessed because I had the opportunity to not only meet Henrik Clarke, but also John Hope Franklin. But a couple things about Black History Month to know, of course, like why it was really started. Understanding that it was started because of the importance of African Americans studying and understanding their history, right? Carter G. Woodson started it in 1926, Negro History Week, eventually expanded to Negro History Month or Black History Month. He selected Negro History Week actually to be the second week in February. So it encompassed both Abraham Lincoln's birthday and Frederick Douglass' birthday. So, a lot of times there are jokes about, it's the shortest month of the year. That's why it's selected. No, there was a lot of intentionality about that. But I wanted to play just some words of Henrik Clarke. If you've never heard him speak, I think this is a very important, poignant, and powerful piece, this first 60 seconds.
You guys see my screen?
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
History is a clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day. It is also a compass that people use to find themselves on the map of human geography. History tells of people where they have been and what they have been, where they are and what they are. Most important, history tells a people where they still must go, what they still must be. The relationship of history to the people is the same as the relationship of a mother to her child.
Okay. Yeah. So if you've never had a chance to listen to or study Henrik Clarke, I really strongly encourage you. Also reading the work of John Hope Franklin, famed historian and scholar. What I appreciate about his books, and some of you may or may not know this, but prior to the integration of public schools, John Hope Franklin's work were required reading in Black schools. That's unfortunately one of the things that was lost through the integration process, is that students didn't get a chance to study and understand who they are and whose they are and understand their history. Next slide. So also, in thinking about Black history, there are a few things to note. So before there was American history, there was Black history, right? And if you look at and you think about I'm sorry, can I ask everybody to mute their mics? Okay. And so that's important. So one of the things on this slide, do you see the book cover that says Africa and Egypt? Everybody see that? Okay. Everybody see that part? What's wrong with that? What's wrong with that book cover? This is a book cover. Africa and Egypt. What's wrong with that?
Egypt is in Africa.
Egypt, exactly. We wouldn't say Westchester in Pennsylvania, right? Like that sounds ludicrous, but it's this constant effort to separate Egypt from Africa, right? Because of what we think and know right about Egypt, right? In terms of the civilization, the mystery of the pyramids, right? How in the world could they have built those pyramids, without the engineering tools of today? How do you move something that weighs 2 tons, right? So, and then the other thing is, if you read the work of Ivan Van Sertima, famed anthropologist, they came before Columbus. There was actually an African presence in the Americas before Columbus. And we know this because of these huge Olmec heads. Now, of course, this is just a souvenir I picked up in Mexico. This is well known and understood history, throughout Central America and Mexico, right? You have these huge stone heads. And of course, you can date the stones. So as anthropologists dated these stones, they found that they were well before 1492, right? And this either depicted what the people looked like or whom the people came in contact with, right? And so as you look at those stone heads, and you can see like its relationship, for example, to a gentleman standing, how huge these stone heads were, you know, and then the picture above, that's a Nubian chief beside a stone head. And this, right, it's just uncanny, right? How close in looks, right, they are. So we can go to the next slide. And then finally, I think this is my final slide before we get to the clip. How many of you have read Newsweek magazine, right? Well known, right? Well-respected magazine. This is a cover in the 1990s. Newsweek, the search for African Eve, scientists explore a controversial theory about man's origins. So look at what's depicted on that cover. Any of you recall this cover? Probably not. So why is it controversial? The notion that Adam and Eve, you know,
were white, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Or this is the challenge, even as we talk about banned books and the depiction of Black history. You know, as a child, I grew up reading every autobiography I could find in the library for an African American. Like throughout my school, I don't know why, I just fell in love with autobiographies by Black authors. And so I just devoured them. But just think if I had gone into my library and picked up this book about Hannibal by Harold Lamb. Now, Hannibal, right, was a warrior from Carthage, North Africa, right, whose military strategy is actually still studied even today. Yet this is how Harold Lamb depicts Hannibal on the cover of his book. But if you look down, that's more like what a depiction of Hannibal would have looked like. And so even our children aren't getting accurate history. There's always this effort to distort or just not tell the truth when it comes to Black history. And it is a real challenge. So with that said, I want to make sure we get to our video and then to our discussions. So this TED Talk is by Julieanna Richardson. I think Beth or Paige are gonna, take us to it. Again, if you could mute your mics.
As a little Black girl, I did not know that American history had anything to do with someone who looked like me. American history was George Washington cutting down his cherry tree. American history was white. Raised in a small steel mining town of Duquesne, Pennsylvania, my family moved to Newark, Ohio, not New Jersey, but Ohio, when I was age 9. And one day, the teacher asked us to talk about our family backgrounds. My classmates' hands literally rose up like arrows to the sky. I'm part German, I'm part Italian, I'm part French, I'm part Polish, Jewish. They all had hyphenates. What was I? The only thing that we studied back then about Black people were the other George Washington, Tuskegee Institute's George Washington Carver. And my white teacher said he could do a lot of things with peanuts. And then there was the taboo issue of slavery, and no one wanted to be associated with slavery. So to my 9-year-old brain, those two facts together did not compute. How could he have done all those things with peanuts when all we had been were slaves? So I mumbled something like Negro or Black, Native American, because most Black people think they have Native American blood in them. And I added in French, I lied. My father had been stationed in France, but I wanted to have a history also, that sense of not knowing and not belonging stayed with me until my sophomore year at Brandeis University. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was a fall day. The leaves were a golden brown, and I'm in New York Schomburg's library with my headphones on, listening to this song. Just wild about Harry, Harry's wild about me. This song that I associated with President Harry Truman, I had found, who was a white president, I had found in a Black music collection, in a Black library written by a Black songwriting team of Noble Sissel and Eubie Blake.
So sorry, guys. Let me fix that.
In the 1921 production of Shuffle Along on Broadway, I was thrilled, and I went up to the librarian, the famous librarian, Jean Blackwell Hudson. She gave me a list of people to interview, and I had my tape recorder in hand. Today it would be an iPhone, and I went out and interviewed Gone with the Wind's Butterfly McQueen, Lee Whipper, who was the oldest living Black actor at the time, historian John Henrik Clarke, and tap dancer Honey Coles. I had found myself. I had a history to call my own. I too, according to Langston Hughes, I too am America. And from that day forward, my life was forever changed. Today, from our boardrooms to our classrooms, on TV and social media, debates are raging about whose history matters. Those who document their history are who society says matters. For the Black community, that documentation has been elusive. How many of you had heard about Tulsa and its Black Wall Street until recently? Let me see a show of hands. Great. But there are those who don't. Black people went from having absolutely no rights to the US electing its first Black president. Our civil rights gains paved the way for the women's movement, the gay rights movement, and the social movements of today. In the 1960s, we had found ourselves, and James Brown led the way. Say it loud. I'm Black and I'm proud. He did it for us. That became our national anthem. And recently, I attended the estate sale of Porgy and Bess's Etta Moulton Barnett. She had the famous contralto voice. And her husband, Claude Barnett, Pan-Africanist, who was founder of the Associated Negro Press. In their home, literally, was clothing and furniture and rare books and artwork that demonstrated the fineness of their lives. But as I approached one room, I looked to my side and I saw something I should not have seen there. There were family photographs and letters and scrapbooks. As the estate seller yelled out, cash and carry, I told her, you can't do that, not with this. A local university had offered $3,000 for the entire collection. I told her, please give it to me. Honestly, I'll take it and preserve it. These are family heirlooms. She told me it would be $250,000. $250,000? I don't have that. I bought the little I could. But that priceless, intact, one-of-a-kind collection from that day forth of rich Black history, 100 years of rich Black history, was henceforth scattered to the wind. The same thing happened at the estate sale of poet Maya Angelou. And if that does not resonate with you, then I want you to think forward at the estate sale of young poet laureate Amanda Gorman, that her writings and her poetry would suffer a similar fate. We have in this country already lost a lot of the 17th, 18th, and 19th century documentation of the African American experience. We can ill afford to lose the 20th and the 21st century. Preservation will determine if the Black community is viewed as valueless or valueful. Consider 17-year-old Darnella Frazier and that 9 minutes and 29-second recording of George Floyd's murder, and the complete disregard that it showed society having of Black life. We in the Black community have always had value. It's just been hidden from view, not well documented. Over 20 years ago, I sat at my dining room table. I was unemployed, no kids, and single. And you get to the point in your life when you start asking, what will be your leave behind, your legacy? And those stories of my sophomore year came back to me. I took my love of the theater, my degree in American Studies, my legal training from Harvard Law School, and I set out to create the nation's largest African American video oral history archive. It's called The History Makers, and back then, lots of people had thought I had lost my mind. But we've interviewed thousands and thousands of African American leaders. One early interview was of civil rights leader Julian Bond. We had traveled from Chicago to Washington, D.C. We had asked him to bring photos of him, and one of the photos was like the one here. And when he walked into the room, literally, I was taken back to my 12-year-old self and my serious crush on him when I had seen him. Look at those curls. Chairman of the NAACP, he had been one of the student leaders for SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. At the tender age of 25, he had been elected to the Georgia House of Representatives. Georgia being Georgia then and now, and there being no Stacey Abrams in sight. They refused to seat him, and his case went up to the US Supreme Court, and he won. He was seated. Another early interview was of Tuskegee Airman Colonel Bill Thompson. We arrived at Colonel Thompson's house, and he had prepared for us for 4 days. He had boxes and boxes of material that are now housed at the Air and Space Museum at the Smithsonian. He sits me down. He says, "Do you know of the Golden 13? I said, "No, Colonel Thompson, I've never heard of the Golden 13. He said they were the Navy's version of the Tuskegee Airmen, and there are 4 left living in the country, and 1 lives upstairs. And he'd like to talk to you also." It was at that moment that I knew that we were on a path of great discovery. 4 years later, I'm seated next to General Colin Powell. Of course, I try to get him to interview with me. He so politely declines. Then I tell him my Colonel Bill Thompson story. He tells me about the Montfort Point Marines, that they were the Marines version of the Tuskegee Airmen. The Tuskegee Airmen, the Navy's Golden 13, the Montfort Point Marines. All 3 helped desegregate the US Armed Forces, but unfortunately, most people only know of the Tuskegee Airmen. We have such an opportunity to make change. Our crews have traveled to 413 cities and towns across the United States. Our collection is housed permanently in the Library of Congress. Our digital archive, thanks to the computer geniuses at Carnegie Mellon, is now accessible worldwide, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, on all kinds of portable devices and computers and phones. We have interviewed, as I said, thousands of African American leaders. There's Alonzo Petty, the oldest living Black cowboy, Katherine Dunham, the inventor of Black dance, Katherine Johnson, the NASA scientist whose story was portrayed in the movie Hidden Figures, poets Nikki Giovanni and Sonia Sanchez, and Ursula Burns, the first Black female CEO of a Fortune 500 company. We are now the digital repository for the Black experience, and it will include those digitized copies of the family heirlooms that I spoke of us losing. When I think back on my fourth grade self, I have such compassion for her. A little Black girl in a sea of white faces in rural Ohio. Little did she know that Black history was all around her. Yards from her home was the first Black school built for Black children by a man named Shackelford, who sat at gunpoint, daring any white mob to tear down his school for Black children. Her hometown of Newark, Ohio, was also the 1815 birthplace for Edward James Roy, who had tired of life in America and migrated back to Africa, and in 1870, he had become the 5th president of the African country of Liberia. What if she had known that being president of a country would be possible for someone who looked like her? What if her classmates had known that history and that would have changed their views and their world experience? You all know that I'm that little girl. And when I had spoken to General Powell, he told me that no one can change their yesterdays, but all of us can change our tomorrows. I ask you today to join with me in changing America's tomorrows so that the Black community and its experience and its history will have an undeniable place and permanent place in this great country and in America's lexicon. I also ask you to join me that so no child will ever feel that way that I felt in that classroom when I did not know the history that was my legacy. We can all work together and make this happen. Thank you for listening to this little Black girl's story. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
If we can go to the discussion page and show that on the screen, please. We've heard from 3 phenomenal speakers, and I mean that so sincerely, because each time Dr. Richelle and Dr. Tracey share, it's enlightening to me, and I trust you all feel the same way. And the third being Dr. Richardson, who just shared her video. Now it's an opportunity for us to break into smaller groups, so we have some more in-depth conversations. And that's why we do this, smaller groups, just so that we can have more time to spend and discuss some things. So as we prepare to break into smaller groups, each of you will be in a room with either Dr. Richelle or Dr. Tracey. And then Karen Simmons, our CEO for the Community Foundation, will be in one room. I'll be in the other room. But when we begin this process of discussion, let's identify ourselves, talk about who we are, what brought us to this community conversation. What did you learn? What did you want to learn? And then your discussion questions. These are great discussion questions, we think, but if you have something else, feel free to share that. But how does power impact how history is told. Historians use various sources, written records, oral traditions, material culture, archaeological evidence, folkways, customs to make sense of the past. How has this impacted the way Black history has been gathered and told? Another question, how does missing or inaccurate history impact us individually and as a community? How can the inclusion of multiple perspectives and experiences clarify our understanding of the past? And then the final question on this page, how we uncover and discuss the lives of individuals traditionally excluded or silenced by the written word. What can we do to learn and spread the word of the true history about history, historic events, and people? So I'm going to ask Paige or Beth to break us up into two separate groups. I hope that all of you will stay as long as you can and engage in the conversation, and let these discussion points be your guide as we start this conversation.
You know, Timmy, after the breakouts end, we'll just go away. We won't come back to plenary. So, Paige, do you have another slide on what our next community conversation is about? I cannot remember. Yeah, Timmy, you want to talk about what we're doing next month, what we're trying to do next month?
Most definitely. Some of you may have heard of her, Foreman John. Foreman John is doing some phenomenal things in nutrition, health, and wellness. And we've got her plan to join us on the 12th. We've got some more discussions taking place right now, but it looks like she's going to be able to join us and share with us what she's doing in the most natural way to make sure that she focuses on the betterment of all of us via nutrition, health, and wellness. So stay tuned. That is planned to be our next conversation on March 12th, once again at noon, from noon to 1 o'clock.
Okay. Thank you. And it looks like we're ready to divide into breakouts. So take it away, Dr. Richelle and Dr. Tracey. And thanks for Timmy for